And we have a pilot project in Panama, and we're starting up projects in Brazil and several other countries. And we're really happy to be hosting these two extraordinary scientists today to talk about the application of deep learning to ecological restoration. So I'll start by introducing our panelists. We have Trevor Keenan. So Trevor is an assistant professor at Berkeley's College of Natural Resources. As a global change environmental scientist, Trevor's work spans from individual organisms, primarily phototrophs, to ecosystems, landscapes, and the globe. His interests are centered on understanding the future of the terrestrial carbon sink and the potential of natural climate solutions by examining the impacts of climate variability and long-term change on terrestrial ecosystem function. His work combines large ecological data sets, models of ecosystem state and function, machine learning, and data assimilation to gain a mechanistic understanding of key physical and biological processes. So welcome, Trevor. And we also have with us today, Brookie Gudzer-Williams. Brookie is the Director of Data Science at the World Resources Institute. His work focuses on leveraging satellite imagery and machine learning to better understand stresses on the Earth's natural resources and how best to promote a sustainable planet. Brookie's background is in theoretical physics. He was an international postdoctoral fellow for the National Science Foundation, and Brookie has a PhD in, believe it or not, string theory from the University of California, Santa Barbara, and an undergraduate degree in both math and physics from University of Colorado. So welcome, both of you. So happy to be here with you today. And I wanted to open up by just asking each of you, what have you been working on lately that you can share with this group? And let's start with you, Brookie.
Oh, thanks so much for having me. This is exciting, and it's great to see such a large turnout. It's good to see large, diverse groups coming together to work on important problems. So I have been focused on a lot of things. I think a lot of my work recently has actually been turned more towards urban environments, where focusing on building global urban land use maps, which I'm really excited about, that have a lot of applications from understanding access to green space to growth of cities, and just there's understanding where new informal settlements are popping up, and what are the drivers for that, et cetera. I've also been working, I'm starting to do some work now on, and I've done work in the past on reflectance of rooftops and like urban kind of like heat issues, which have huge implications on health and environment, and also kind of climate implications. I've been doing a lot of work on land use more generally on the global scale. WRI, in collaboration with Google, is in the process of putting out a global land use product, which maybe I'll have a chance to talk about more later. But it's like a global land use map, except it gets updated with every single Sentinel image that comes in, and we're putting out the probabilities with that. So it's going, as you start moving from these sort of static maps, which so often my work is focused on, to trying to understand changes in ecosystems or kind of global changes and drivers for different kinds of change, having something that's giving you the kind of strength of different signals every 4 or 5 days. I mean, we're creating global products like that. I think every couple of weeks or less, you'll cover the entire globe. So that's really exciting. And they've already produced maps from 2000, or they've already produced products for every Sentinel image from 2015 to date. And although the data is not released, we're waiting on that to be kind of released through, once it gets through peer review. It is available on Google Earth Engine, and I can share that asset for any researchers who want to start diving into the data. In addition, I'm doing work on detecting trees, where WRI has been working on trees outside of forest, trees and mosaic landscapes product. And that was done by some other researchers. They've done an amazing job, and I'm looking at extending that backwards in time using Landsat data instead of Sentinel data. So it's not going to be quite as accurate, quite as high resolution, but it'll be nice to have that historical archive. So this becomes really important because, you know, most of the tree products that are out there aren't getting the trees that are, you know, spread throughout farms or within urban environments. And in total, this is actually a pretty large contribution, you know, significant contribution to various reasons you might be interested in, you know, what trees are out there and what effect they're having on the environment. So there's a few more things I'm tinkering around on, but those are occupying most of my brain space right now.
Thanks, Brookie. That's a lot.
It's too much. It's too much.
Maybe we can have a separate conversation around how you organize all that work. Hey, on to you, Trevor. Would love to hear about what you've been up to.
Sure, thanks, Patrick, and thanks, Brookie. It's great to hear about your work, and it's great to be here. I'm very excited about the excitement in this community and the broader Earthshot community about how we can leverage the technical skills and knowledge that you all represent to improve our understanding of the potential for the environment to offset our emissions and our potential to restore actively the environment. So that's something we're very focused on here in my group at Berkeley. So when I talk about what I'm working on, it's also what my group is working on. So we are 7 postdoctoral scientists in the group, 4 PhD students, and a small army of undergraduate researchers, all focused on carbon sequestration and ecosystem health, stability, and function. So we're super interested in this because ecosystems globally currently, they're taking out about 1/3 of what we put into the atmosphere, right? So all the fossil fuel emissions, the oil burning, the cement production, everything that releases into the atmosphere of CO2, ecosystems take out 1/3 of it and store it. So this is a huge ecosystem service that's really helping to slow down the rate at which CO2 accumulates in the atmosphere, and therefore slowing down climate change. So if they weren't doing this, we'd have CO2 in the atmosphere that we don't expect until the 2050 or 2060, you know? So it's really important, this thing that they're doing, but we don't really understand 2 things. One is how or why they're doing it. You know, what are the processes involved? And where are the carbons going? Right? Is it going into the tropics, into the high latitude ecosystems? We don't have a good handle on that. And another important thing that we don't understand that I think is particularly interesting to this community is how can we juice those processes, right? So how can we get ecosystems to uptake even more through actively regenerating the land surface, right? So that's something work in my group is really focused on. We have a variety of different projects around that theme, primarily looking at remote sensing observations of how ecosystems are changing over time. And that can be change on very high frequency from 1 hour to the next, or from one day to the next, or over longer term, you know, over 30 decades, how are the ecosystems changing? And that can be in response to things we do, like going and cutting them down. It's a pretty obvious change you can track, or it's more subtle. You know, they could be changing because obviously climate is changing. And this is changing the conditions that organisms find themselves in, and they're changing slowly in response to that. And they're also changing because we're putting CO2 in the atmosphere. It's kind of like a fertilizer for plants, and so they're changing very subtly because of that too. And so figuring out what those changes are and how we can expect it to keep continuing into the future is one of the key questions we work on. So I mentioned remote sensing data. We also use distributed sensor networks. So my group is the central node for the sensor network across the Americas, where we have over 500 stations continuously making measurements of carbon fluxes between ecosystems in the atmosphere and sending us that data. And then we process it, we harmonize it, and we make it widely available for the greater good for the community to use. That's our mission, pretty much. So this is hugely useful data, because for every half hour, and this, I say half hour because that's the time scale we've traditionally worked on, but we have, measurements are at 10 or 20 hertz. So you can imagine just how much information these sensors are generating. But typically that's a little bit too much for most ecosystem scientists to work with. They're not used to big data. They can handle small, big data. But every half hour, they're measuring this exchange of carbon between an ecosystem and the atmosphere. And that changes depending on the environment. You know, if the radiation loads change, the temperature changes. So from those changes, we can detect exactly how ecosystems are responding to the environment. So we can calculate things such as how much photosynthesis is happening at a given moment in time, how much microbes are respiring. Super useful information for constraining models that we'll talk a bit later, I guess, and also for machine learning applications. So we do a lot of, obviously there's a huge amount of information, and it's really only fully leveraged through applying machine learning techniques. And I think we'll talk a bit more about that in a bit, so I won't go into it now. But just to give you a sense of the breadth of observation types and the amount of information we work with. You often think of, I guess, ecosystem scientists as somebody who goes out and, you know, walks in the woods or throws a quadrant and sees what's inside it when it lands on the ground, counts things. But we have moved a long way from that into a space where we have more data and observations than we know how to deal with. Which is one of the reasons why I'm particularly excited about a lot of people here and that I'm interacting with through Earthshot are coming from a machine learning or data science background, and have a lot of skills to bring to bear on these problems. I think I've covered everything except modeling, but I think we might talk about that in a bit as well. But fundamentally at its core, we're trying to understand how ecosystems work and how they're likely to change as we change the climate, or as we change them directly through manipulating them through planting trees, or by artificially trying to help regenerate a depleted system.
Thank you, Trevor. And that's a nice segue into just, I think I'll take the liberty of answering my own question from Earthshot Labs' point of view. We are very, very focused on reforestation and assisted natural regeneration, or ANR. And this is because we still live in a world where people are economically incented to chop down trees, unfortunately. And this is resulting in widespread ecological destruction and a range of different ecological collapses. So our strategy for countering this is to make it really, really easy and economically rewarding for land stewards to onboard to carbon marketplaces through reforesting their land. And in the future, we plan to support a bunch more ecological restoration scenarios, including straight up conservation, water restoration, agroforestry, and so on. But we're starting with reforestation. And so we've been focusing a lot of our efforts on researching the best ways of forecasting future biomass growth so that we can use that data in order to formulate high quality carbon offsets that we can then sell onto the carbon marketplaces. And there's another effort that supports this where we're building an app called Biome that is a citizen science app. And the idea there is to make it really easy and fun, excuse me, to collect a range of different natural observations, starting with tree measurements. So one of the raw materials of essentially forecasting biomass growth, as well as formulating usable carbon credits, is measuring trees. So there's a good old-fashioned, originating from the forestry world, and it's still with us as being a core piece of data that currently is quite surprisingly sort of expensive and inconvenient to gather, involving tape measures and recording down numbers and so on. And so we're building an app called Biome that makes it as easy as scanning a barcode to go and collect accurate tree measurements, and also to classify the species and log that for use with ecological research efforts, as well as formulating carbon offsets. So with that, my next question for all of us is, what do you see as being the most interesting opportunities or ways of applying machine learning, deep learning or otherwise, to ecosystem modeling? And let's start with you, Brookie. You're still muted, Brookie.
I promise only to stay muted 3 or 4 more times during this call. Yeah, so it's interesting. This is an area that's outside of my expertise. I mean, as I mentioned in the beginning, I've mainly been focused on, what can I say is happening on the Earth now? What is a snapshot of, I take some piece of satellite imagery, what's going on the ground. And honestly, it really wasn't until I started speaking more with the team at Earthshot, thinking more about the processes on the ground. So I probably have the least to say of everyone, so it's just a caveat. I'm excited to hear Trevor's thoughts on this, but the thing that has occurred to me during these discussions is there's kind of 2 sides of it. One is there is just so much data now, and a lot of it coming from, obviously there's a lot of satellite imagery. There's also more and more, there's a lot of kind of reference data and sources for that, for people not to have to go collect it themselves, to go find it. I don't know if people are aware of Radiant Earth's ML Hub. I think that this is a place where they're looking to have a place where everyone can store reference data, so everyone can go use it, and it's in a, it's ready to be used in models, and projects like this are going to just help move things forward. So just the amount of data that's out there is great. I also think the amount of data products that are out there is going to really, really help, because it's just, honestly, there's not going to be perfect reference data. And as people creating the kind of products I have, those that I've been working on, those can really be used as input and target data into different models. And there are issues with that, but I still think it's going to allow this kind of field to move forward. So that's kind of outside of ML it's outside of ML within the actual ecological model, but it's using ML to create inputs and outputs for those models. I've looked around some and seen places where people they have these process models that, work okay, and they've found some improvements by replacing parts of those models with, a neural network, say. And I think there's probably a lot more that can be done here. I think there's places where people are putting more, solving boundary value problems, et cetera, in using neural networks and trying to actually kind of, rather than just kind of replacing pieces of neural network, pieces of existing process models with neural networks. I do think we are, I don't know if it's a year away or 5, but I think we are at the beginning of people being better at creating actual physical models that are almost entirely contained in using neural networks. And I think that's going to be an exciting thing to see how it plays out, but it's all at this stage pretty theoretical. So I think there's some gains there. But again, I know almost nothing about these process models, so I'm excited to turn it over to Trevor and Earthshot to hear their thoughts on that.
Thanks, Brookie. Should I go ahead?
Oh no, please, Trevor. The floor is yours.
Okay. Yeah, so I think it's super interesting. It's a very exciting time in our field in terms of the degree to which interest has dramatically pivoted to machine learning because of the potential it's showing to radically improve the way we do science in terms of, well, primarily focused around modeling, but also, as Brookie mentioned, the potential for developing data products that can be used as boundary conditions for modeling approaches. But so we're in a situation where we have spent the last few decades developing process-based models that are designed to represent in mathematical form each different aspect of an ecosystem. So you have equations that govern how photosynthesis, for example, responds to environmental changes. You have equations that govern the allocation of the assimilated carbon to growth, to woody tissue, fine roots, to new leaves, to respired components. You have equations that govern the energy balance within different layers in the canopy, and also the moisture transitioning through the soil, through different layers of the soil. Now you can imagine, I guess pretty easily, how quickly this can get unfathomably complex, because we're dealing with the natural environment, which is a hideously complex thing, right? If it weren't, then it would be very easy to understand, but it's a very dynamic and interconnected space where everything affects everything else. And you can go down as far as you want in terms of granularity from a canopy scale, landscape scale, down to the molecular level in terms of what you want to describe. And as scientists, we tend to go into the details, right? We want to get the details right. So what we've ended up is we've created these models, such as the community land model, which is a model used to predict ecosystem function globally, both in current, present, and future, under future conditions. That is almost more difficult to understand and run and use than the real world itself is. It's a very, very, very complex model with hundreds of parameters. Everything is interconnected. It's very dynamic, and needs a lot of data with which to run it, in the form of gridded meteorological data. And when I run it, I mean to get it to predict for each grid cell on the planet what the carbon cycle is doing at a particular point in time, how the ecosystem is growing, etc. How much water is being used, and various different components that dictate how an ecosystem interacts with the atmosphere. So we have these really, really complex models that we've developed. And for CLM, for example, it takes a few days to run it on a supercomputer to generate these predictions on a global scale. That makes it very, very difficult to do things like assess the uncertainty associated with different processes, to modify the model in any way, because if you change one thing, you end up changing various different things it's connected to, and to ultimately run different scenarios. So this is where machine learning enters in the model world, right? So people are doing a lot of exciting things in the form of building machine learning emulators for models. And these could be emulators of the whole model system, which has proven super useful for things like parameter sensitivity assessments, or it could be emulators for specific components of a model, that you can imagine building one for a specific component and then switching out similarly built emulators for the same component in different models, because every model has its own way of representing the real world. And what this leads to is a dramatic increase in efficiency, primarily. So for example, CLM takes a few days to run. An emulator trained on CLM, the community land model, can run in a few seconds. So you're talking multiple orders of magnitude of increase in the efficiency with which we can run these models. And that automatically translates to the efficiency with which we can do science, because we don't have to wait for the results. We can iterate very, very rapidly and get this exponential increase in the speed at which we can generate scientific discoveries. And it also means that these models then become more usable in the hands of the interested lay people, right? You don't need a supercomputer to run this state-of-the-art model. You just can run it on your laptop using the machine learning emulator as the backend. And so this directly opens up a lot of opportunities for example, landowners to put in the specific parameters of their parcel of land and generate projections of carbon cycling under different scenarios. Could be one application. Another is generating data products to which we can test these models. So Brookie mentioned this briefly, the idea being that we have observations of the real world, let's say, of some characteristic of an ecosystem but they're in different places, different ecosystems, and they're disparate, they're not continuous. Whereas in the model world, we want to predict globally how ecosystems are functioning. So machine learning has been used quite effectively as an upscaling approach, where you can take these disparate measurements and use them to inform a machine learning framework that can then be used to project what we should expect in places where we don't have measurements, given certain characteristics of that location. So those are the two really exciting use cases that are coming up. Another is really interrogating the models. So no model is right? All models are wrong, but some are useful, as Professor Box famously once said. And so these machine learning can be used to interrogate the models. So for feature importance, for example, for detecting what the partial response functions of the model to different parameters and forcings are, which can be very, very difficult to do when you're dealing with a full model that takes a hideously long time to run. And so the last thing I'd like to mention on this is the potential for physics-informed machine learning. So this is an area of great interest at the minute, where we, as scientists, we see, an immense body of knowledge that we have generated over centuries of researching and studying systems. And when you apply just machine learning to a system, it kind of doesn't make use of all of that body of knowledge, right? So physics-informed machine learning is where you can embed known physical or biological function into the machine learning framework. So you get this hybrid model machine where there is machine learning making statistical inference, but it's also leveraging information from our physical understanding of how the system works. And this has a lot of potential to constrain the space in which a machine learning framework can operate, and by injecting information that's not purely derived from the data, but also from theoretical knowledge. I think I'll leave it at that. Yeah, there's a lot happening. I think it's of huge interest. So I'm faculty in UC Berkeley, but I'm also faculty scientist at the Department of Energy, National Lab at Lawrence Berkeley National Lab. And they're spinning up a very, very big program called AI for Earth System Science at the minute, which I'm involved in. And we're talking like $1 billion investment by the US government directly through the Department of Energy in using machine learning for environmental science research. And so this, just to give you a sense of how much interest there is in the space right now. It's super exciting. And part of it is the government doesn't want to be left behind in the AI space. They recognize other countries are pouring a lot of attention into it. But whatever their motivations, it's good for science, and hopefully we can make it good for the environment too.
Thank you, Trevor. We're all aware that in the last 10, 15 years, there's been this kind of revolution in neural architectures and in the effectiveness of neural nets to solve a wide range of different problems. This spread from computer vision to self-driving cars and human lifelike conversation and many, many other fields of endeavor. But when I first really started looking into the ecological space, I was really struck by a parallel revolution in remote sensing that resulted in a whole bunch of data just being available. And now, if you look at planet.com's data set, it's crazy. Like, they're scanning the world every day or every hour, and there's all these super high resolution data sets showing up that are temporally as well as spatially really, really rich. And so this provides a lot of the raw data needed to build really interesting models. I was also very fascinated because I'd already been thinking from a previous project about applying deep learning models or architectures to emulate the outcome or the output of architectural generative models, which are also very computationally expensive. Maybe not as much as these supercomputer models, but that seemed like a kind of an obvious use case for deep learning that hadn't yet been applied in that field. And so when we met you, Trevor, through Steve, who's also in the audience, he's our principal scientist here at Earthshot Labs, and just started discussing like the application of deep learning for emulating, these ecological simulation models, it was very exciting. It just felt like just a clearly beneficial thing that would really tap into some of the technological zeitgeist surrounding all these deep learning models. I can talk a little bit about at Earthshot, both in the research community as well as in the commercial venture. We've been focused a lot on computer vision. So as I mentioned, there's all these interesting data sets out there that are kind of bitmap, kind of visual in nature. And so we can apply computer vision to identify features. For instance, Troy, my co-founder at Earthshot, and I had this kind of hypothesis that beaver dams have a really great outcome on their surrounding ecology. Like we sort of know this both anecdotally and from studies. And wouldn't it be great if we could find all the beaver dams? Where are they? And there is no data set out there that maps all of this. It does not even close. Like the biggest dam database we could find was maybe 120,000 entries, and a lot of them were pretty sketchy, like sort of user-generated content that hadn't been validated. And so that's orders of magnitude off of the true number of dams out there, including beaver dams. And so to cut a long story short, we found an interesting training set of beaver dam, kind of labeled beaver dam imagery. And we worked in the research community. We found a very wonderful kind of neuroscience researcher who essentially, or computational neuroscience researcher, who helped us build some computer vision models that actually identify other instances of beaver dams using that data set as a training set. And it was really amazing. Like all of a sudden we started finding all these things that hadn't been found before. And this is the kind of thing that we can do when we combine this remote sensing data with neural architectures to perform classification kind of tasks and other forms of machine learning operations. And then I'll just pivot to the Earthshot corporation, where we are using machine vision. I mentioned this before a little bit, to generate really high quality training data for ecological models. And so we've been using computer vision both to identify species of trees, which is surprisingly hard because of the dearth of training data, specifically for bark imagery. And so we've been kind of working on that, as well as a visual computer vision based identifier to actually identify the outline of the tree, which varies, which is kind of local in nature because the surrounding plants vary by location. And so the model has to be trained specifically to be able to exclude non-tree outlines, so we can get a very accurate view on what is tree and what is not tree, and so we can measure it accurately. And as I mentioned before, measuring trees is really critical for ecological research and for carbon verification. So yeah, we're at the very beginning stages of talking to Trevor and figuring out what our strategy is for this whole really exciting endeavor of deep learning based emulation of ecological simulation. But we're already using deep learning in some pretty interesting and effective ways in order to further the cause of data-driven ecological restoration. Okay, so we covered a little bit of this, but what future trends do you see in this field of ecosystem modeling and or the application of deep learning to ecological modeling? Like, what do you see kind of coming over the next 5 years that's going to make this field even more exciting and open up new possibilities for our work? And I guess I'll start with you, Trevor.
Hey, sure. So there are two, I guess there's two questions. Where are the ecological models going? And how can, secondly, machine learning, how can it assist in that? And ecological models in general, they are, our mission typically seems to be to try to break the machine, right? They give us more powerful computers, so we want to build more complex models that use all the computational resource. And so as computation power is increasing over time, we've been developing more and more detailed land surface or ecological models. So you can think of the difference between currently the state of the art, I guess, is representing the canopy of an ecosystem as something of a green slime, right? An relatively undefined space of green with multiple layers of green, with not distinguishing between different individuals that are contributing to that, the different species involved. And we're moving towards a space where you can have competing individuals. So where you're actually modeling each individual tree. Currently, it's done through cohorts of trees with similar characteristics, but they're competing for space. They're growing and competing each other out for light, and their roots are entwining below ground and searching for nutrients, also in competition, growing mycorrhizal fungi if they can, or whatever their associations are. And this, instead of prescribing what's there and how it should grow, you let it emerge from the system, from this competition. So it's an incredibly complex task because it's a dynamic system, very nonlinear interactions. Getting coexistence between different species can be hard. Setting up the model system correctly so that one doesn't just outcompete the other and become the dominant species, because that's not how the real world works. We have a lot of coexistence everywhere. So that's one space that's increasing in the model world, where people are very excited about this potential for very resolved, individual-based modeling of ecosystem dynamics. It's a little bit ahead of the curve, or so. It's been 10 years before its time, because we don't have a lot of the information needed to initialize such systems. This part of what the Biome Initiative through Earthshot is really focused on getting that data. Who's there? What are the individuals? How big are they? For example, we don't know that at large scales. Remote sensing is getting there, but it's not quite there yet. So another thing that's happening in the model world that links more closely to the machine learning applications is modularization of these models. So this is not a very super sexy topic, but it's very, very important, because we've built these models, as I say, that are very, very interconnected and very dependent on different components within the model. And often, and so I mentioned one model, the community land model, but there are tens of these models built by different teams around the world. They're all built a little differently, and the projections can be quite different. So it's hard to compare why their projections are different, or what exactly is different about them. So modularizing models basically means isolating specific components of a model. And so if you have two models and you isolate the same components from the rest of the model, you can then switch them out and allow the implications of the difference in this model. What if you put that into the other model, switch it out, what does that imply for changes in model predictions? So modularizing models is something that a lot of effort is going into in order so that we can better understand what they're doing. Because as I said before, we've built these things that are almost more complex to understand than the real world. Now machine learning in a model framework helps with this a lot, because you can therefore, instead of building an emulator for the total aggregate model, you can build it for specific components. So for these modules within the model. So you could have a machine learning module for photosynthesis, or a machine learning module for the development of new wood or growing rings on a tree. And this allows you to really zone in to the focal area of interest for which you may have direct observations that can be used to build the machine learning model. And through this, directly ingest the observations into the process-based model with this machine learning component. I'm not sure if I'm communicating effectively how important this is, or how difficult it is to do without machine learning, because we have these complex models, we have observations that you would imagine you can easily use to test them or to integrate them through data assimilation. But because they're so complex, it's really hard to do that. To assimilate data into a model, you need to run it 100,000 times through some kind of Kalman filter or Markov chain Monte Carlo process to optimize the parameters. If the model takes 2 days to run, you're not going to do that, right? So by using machine learning, you can it forms a bridge to the real world effectively, which is not a way that we commonly think of machine learning in this case, but in the model space, it definitely is, because it allows you to directly couple real world observations into a much more complex process-based model. So I'm very excited about that space developing further and just making it a lot easier to do the kind of science that we do through leveraging machine learning in as part of model components as that bridge.
Thanks, Trevor. And opening the floor to you, Brookie. What excites you about the future of this?
What excites me about the future of this? I think the main thing that excites me about it is that it needs to be better understood. You guys are directly discussing, some of the most challenging and necessary questions of, how do we move forward with a lot of the environmental challenges. And then as far as, what do I see future? Again, I'm coming outside of this ecological modeling perspective. And so much of this kind of becomes a repeat of my response to the first question, but just knowing there is so much more data out there. How can we improve both on the accuracy of what we're doing and the timescale at which we can do it, and the insights we can draw from it. I was really fascinated by Trevor's discussion at the end there about this modularization process. And I'm really interested in, I'd love to talk to Trevor more, either in the context of this call or, just future discussions about how isolated can you make these modules? Like if you have two components like photosynthesis and things relating to soil and water and other things that might impact the photosynthesis itself, and you have these discrete modular parts. In principle, you'd have these nonlinear interactions that we're talking back and forth between them. And you had mentioned this idea of different research groups developing models where you could kind of pass in and out these things to see what these differences are. As you were talking, I was imagining a single model structure that both allows for these pieces to be taken in and out, and also allows for kind of the interconnectivity. And so what I'm thinking of when people think about designs of neural network architectures like UNets or so forth, and there's these skip connections, you can imagine modular parts that have a specific structure, like you've required a structure, like they have certain skip connections that go back and forth. And so you can still take a piece out, but when you put a new piece in, it's going to be able to talk to its neighbors. And I actually think there's probably some really interesting thing to do there. Now, it's going to be harder for collaboration between research groups, but you could build this mammoth architecture that allows you to do a lot of interplay between these modulars. Like I find that fascinating from it's fun to think about in a purely academic sense. And it sounds like it would be really useful as well. So I'd love to learn more.
Me too. Just for my part, like I'm seeing out there in other fields this continuation of kind of like a golden age of neural architectures arising. Like we've seen the power and also the interesting effects of generative adversarial networks, most commonly and popularly known for deepfakes. But that's, I think, something that could have a profound impact on this field as well. We had some crazy brainstorming going on last year with James Parr, the director of FDL, around adapting some GAN work that he'd done for flood map detection, flood map prediction, to essentially help landowners or land stewards to visualize the future of their of ecological restoration performed on their land by essentially generating satellite imagery from the future. And so they can see trees regrowing. We could plaster that onto or render that onto a terrain map to provide some really detailed and inspiring visualization of the projects that we propose for their land. So that could be a really interesting application of GANs to help, I guess, provide color and visualization to the outcomes of our ecological simulation models. Another area that's really progressing by leaps and bounds, this is something that I kind of worked on a little bit while I was at Google in the domain of human speech recognition. We have these models now called transformers. You might have heard of GPT-3, which is this super, almost eerie eerily intelligent human language kind of interpretation system that uses neural nets in an interesting new way that's better than recurrent neural nets by all measures. And I've already seen papers emerging, recent papers from last year, that start to think about the application of these methods to spatiotemporal data sets, which of course might be directly applicable to the domain of emulation of ecological simulation using deep learning networks. So this is very kind of bleeding edge, but I foresee that in the next 5 years that there's going to be increasing kind of, I guess, sort of transference, to overload that term, of architectures that arise in different domains, like human language comprehension or other areas, maybe funny internet memes, into this area to provide value. Okay.
Yeah.
I want
to, Patrick, before you move on, I just want to throw out that this idea of this almost aesthetic color that GANs could add to kind of help people visualize what their land could look like and then serve as a motivating factor. If you could trust your GANs, I just want to point out that if you could produce this, you would answer your core question of what will it look like, right? Not from a visual standpoint, but how many trees are going to be there. You could start measuring the kind of carbon that exists within the predicted GAN image. So it goes beyond just the motivational tool and can actually get into the science as long as you could trust the predictive behavior of the GANs.
Yeah, it's actually really interesting and kind of eerie how this kind of can work out. Like, you reminded me of actually something ingenious that our biome developer Isaac did, which is that we kind of lacked a lot of data for essentially identifying tree versus non-tree in the landscape, and he actually started generating it just kind of using Blender-like tools, just superimposing tree imagery on all sorts of weird backgrounds, and it worked. And I felt like, wow, that's sort of almost, the computer is training the computer. Like, where does this end? So that was a really, really fun and interesting and surprisingly effective, at least surprising to me. I don't think it was surprising to him, that actually worked so well. Of course, we have to augment that with real data, regional, as I mentioned before, but to get us to really bootstrap the neural net, it actually was surprisingly effective and he did it very quickly because it was all automatically generated, which was fascinating. But yeah, I really like that idea of taking it one step further and actually measuring the simulated future landscape. Why not? I mean, we can test the results and see see how they stack up as far as accuracy by backtesting and the like.
That's super cool, Patrick. I just want to say one application that comes to mind that I've been thinking of but didn't think of in that framework would be, people hear a lot about climate change, risks, etc. But if you could generate something that provides a visual representation of what model projections say their backyard will look like, or the landscape that they see out their window will look like in 100 years under projected climate change, how will the vegetation change and look different?
Totally.
That could really bring it home,
Absolutely. I want to tell a little story quickly because we're sort of coming up on the hour, but we had a researcher in our community who did a bunch of research in Costa Rica surrounding the absorption of water by trees in the cloud forest and so on. And this project involved reforestation because he was trying to convince farmers to essentially grow trees on their land and measure the results and so on. And I asked him, like, how do you do that? They're not economically incented to do that. And he said, oh, it was really easy. I just told them that certain types of birds and animals would return to their land if they grew a bunch of trees there. And it was so easy to convince them of that. And so that's one of the many reasons why we're really into biodiversity as being a big marker for what we're doing, because sequestering carbon is not enough. And restoring animals and birds and so on is super inspiring to people. And with these methods, we could maybe be able to really depict that and inspire people by showing them visually what's going to happen, what wonderful things are going to happen. Okay, so in the time we have remaining, I'd like to ask each of you a question specific to you. So Brookie, I just can't help but ask about this because it's so fascinating to me personally. But how does your background in string theory help you, if at all, with your ecological work at WRI? Like, it's just such it seems, we do observe quite a few astrophysics, people, as James Parr would say, looking up turning to look downwards to the earth. But just, anything you can share about that would be just fascinating.
Yeah, so it kind of depends at what level you want. It's easy to say none, and it's easy to say a lot. So a lot of the stuff I spent my time thinking about as a string theorist, in particular non-geometric compactification. So string theory is not useful at all. But what is useful, well, on several levels, kind of moving from more abstract to more applied, simply like when you start reading papers on neural networks and kind of how they work and the best of our theoretical understanding on some abstract scale, it's much easier for me to understand those papers just simply because the formalism is similar. And so from that, and a lot of that is very abstract, and who knows how useful it'll be, but I do find that it helps guide my intuition when I'm trying to think about how to construct architectures and make decisions on what might be useful and what not. So there is some sense and how some of the kind of abstract formalism of the mathematics I would use kind of guides my intuition. And then moving kind of backwards to something more actually applied, when I start doing analysis, having to think a little bit more about understanding, the data that the data that's being put out. I have a very strong background in statistics and mathematics, and that was required for me to become a string theorist. And it turns out those same tools are very useful at some level. And then kind of almost moving away from string theory, but just to physics, like I was recently speaking to someone who's trying to decide what college to go to, and they were interested in doing physics or engineering. And there's no offense to the engineers out there, I was strongly pushing for physics. But one of the reasons for that, I think, is, so much, so often as you're an early career person, you need to have some basis, and then you're going to learn the skills you need when you start working on some particular problem. And I just think the background in physics, it makes it, I don't want to say easy, because there's so much hard stuff out there, but I feel like I have a really good basis to understand why things are happening. Now, the technical details of how they happen and why people are making modeling choices and so forth is always hard. But, when I feel like I can look at a new subject and read a paper and understand the kind of how they're doing what they're doing, and kind of the underlying physical processes, at least on some base level. So I just feel like it's a really broad education that has allowed me to kind of pick up different areas rapidly. But all that said, like when I really think about where my head was when I was on a daily basis thinking deeply about string theory, that is rarely applied. So.
Thank you. And Trevor, what is next for your research group at Berkeley? It sounds like you have a really great group together and doing some really interesting work. And then what other groups out there can people check out that are doing some really interesting work as well?
Sure. So I just want to second what Brookie was saying. There's so many people. Some of the most effective people in our field are coming from a physics background. I don't know if they were doing string theory per se, but it seems super useful for logical thought, basically. I think, which is what we all need to do. So what are we working on? At the minute, we're focused pretty heavily on generating observation-based data products of carbon sequestration globally. So using this network of automated sensor data that I mentioned earlier, combined with machine learning approaches to project spatial and temporal variation in how ecosystems are taking up carbon from the atmosphere. And this merges also with remote sensing data. And so I'm very excited about that because it's a very big project. So it involves thousands of sites from around the world and the data that they're collecting. So it's integrating from the on-the-ground data collection all the way up to global projections. We're very focused on the risks associated with carbon sequestration as well. So the impact of drought on ecosystem function and how likely that is to change in the future as the climate changes. It's a big unknown to what extent the world will get drier or wetter in the future from an ecological perspective, and how ecosystems will respond to that. Here in California, we hear a lot about the wildfires, the extended drought that we're in now. These are serious risks to ecosystems under climate change, and risks to carbon sequestration as well, biodiversity and everything else we care about. So those are some of the key things that we're focused on at the minute. I encourage you to go check out my webpage to see what individual projects we're doing, to see if it sparks any interest. It's keenangroup.info. I'll put it in the chat later, but please do head over there and check it out. There are lots of other groups that are doing exciting research in the space. Some that come to mind, so Tapio Schneider is a very interesting professor at Caltech who's leading the Klima Model Initiative. So this is an initiative founded by the Schmidt Foundation to build a primarily machine learning based Earth system model. So it's a huge project and a very, very big endeavor to basically rewrite Earth system models to be primarily based on machine learning. So go check Tapio Schneider, his research out. I can put these in the chat in a minute as well. Rob Jackson at Stanford has been doing a lot of interesting work on ecosystem function and how ecosystems, particularly rooting depth, changes over time. He's now working a lot on methane cycling as well. So we think about restoration impacts on carbon cycling and biodiversity, but methane is a really big greenhouse gas forcer in the atmosphere. And ecosystems can release methane in quite large amounts, especially if they're perturbed. So that's another dimension of the restoration issue that in the Jackson lab they're pretty focused on. Jim Randerson at UC Irvine is doing exciting work with machine learning and particularly with fire prediction. So a fire risk for ecosystems and the implications of climate change for that and different management strategies going into the future. And finally, I'd say Pierre Gentine at Columbia is doing lots of interesting machine learning work, more at the higher level of atmospheric cloud dynamics to integrating to water cycle, resulting water cycling through ecosystems. There are a bunch more, but those are the four at the minute that come to mind. I'll pop those in chat so you can check them out.
Thanks so much, Trevor. Really appreciate that. So before we open things up for questions, I just wanted to do a public service announcement. Like, all of you are cordially invited to our research community, and I'll just share the link for that in the Slack right now. So if you want to continue the conversation, maybe see how you might be able to help out by joining one of the research groups. There's a lot going on. There's a water team, there's a reforestation team, there's a soil team, and you could even create your own team. And we have a wonderful director, Aaron Hirsch, who I think is here in the audience today, who we recently brought on board to run and to grow that community. So with that, does anybody have any questions for any of us about what we've been talking about today?
Hi, I'm Bishal Taba. I'm an undergraduate. I'm graduating this I graduated last semester, and I'm trying to find I'm looking for different PhD opportunities, and one of the things that I'm doing from now until August is to understand deep learning and how I can use it to understand microbial systems. So do you have any suggestion on what are some of the things that I can focus? And it's my first time like using deep learning. So what are some of the suggestions that you can give me to improve or to get where I want to go with deep learning?
I mean, I can start out by just saying, It depends to some extent on your existing knowledge. I will say that Andrew Ng's famous course on machine learning is a great start if you don't already have a background in this field, just to kind of get the basics so you have literacy. Definitely the work that Colin Averill is doing at Funga. He's a world microbial sort of expert. We just spoke to him actually earlier on today. He's a great guy to talk to, and he's part of our research community as well. But curious to hear what the others have to say about this as well.
I think, again, it depends where you're at. I would say that there are a myriad online research, like just tutorial things you can go through. I think ultimately one of the best things you can do is pick a real world problem and do it. I know, there's always Kaggle, and you don't even need to do the competition itself, but you can use it to get your data sets and kind of think through it. I know, the only Kaggle competition I ever looked at was Planet, did one several years ago, which doing something like that where you're actually using satellite imagery might be useful. You should, hopefully you can bounce back and forth between them, but I think at some point, if you're really at the beginning, you should decide either on PyTorch or TensorFlow. I would to throw my feelings into that. When I first saw PyTorch, I thought, this is so much better, I love it. And then I shifted back to TensorFlow. And the reason I did that was because I use Google Earth Engine very heavily. And you can integrate it quite well now that they have their model.predict as part of their platform. And I find it really useful. And also there's been improvements in TensorFlow as they've more tightly integrated Keras. And if you're not using Google Earth Engine and you're interested in this kind of work, it's just such a great point to kind of access a lot of data. And there's the developers group there is really helpful. So I would sign up for that if you haven't already.
Yeah, I've little to add to that. It's all great advice. Suggest start small. Maybe you don't need to jump into deep learning, but depending where you're at, as Theodore has said, you could start with simple multi-layer neural nets, for example. Identify the data set that you want to work with is going to be one of the most important things. Your ability to use deep learning is going to be, or benefit from it will be heavily constrained by the complexity of information in the data set you're using. And just look at all the resources online. There's a great summer school on AI for Earth system science, that all the resources are online. I can post a YouTube link in the chat, and it covers much more than microbial, of course. And I'm sure microbial is in there, or should be if it's not. But anyway, there's a lot of synergies with the other topics that are covered, I'm sure.
I have one more question. So Dr. Keenan, you mentioned about the data that you receive every 30 minutes. Are those data open sourced, or are they for your research purpose only?
Yep, they're open source. Our mission is to make them available for the community. So we receive them, we quality control them, we make sure the format is correct and uniform across all the network, and then make them public. And I'll put the link to that data in the chat too.
All right, thank you.
It's actually a really great question though, Bishal, because a lot of data isn't. Coming into this field, I sort of kind of maybe naively assumed that all the ecological data would just be there and available, and we could just download it, and every single paper would share their code. And it's just not always the case. So the more we can lead by example there, I mean, we definitely want to make the data that we gather using biome and other means available to everyone. In some ways, it's almost like an ethical issue, like the same way with cryptography. We wouldn't want to entrust cryptographic algorithms to any one private institute. That would be bad for humanity, right? And in some ways, we feel the same way about ecological modeling. Like, we wouldn't want one private group to have ownership over the system that essentially is best able to predict the future of our planet and the future of ecological restoration on this planet. So we pretty strongly believe that those models should be open source and the data should be shared. Any other questions in the audience?
I have a question for Trevor. Trevor, you were talking about uses of ML, and initially you mentioned ML can be used to emulate a model, LSM model like CLM, so that we get predictions fast. And you then went on to say that all models are imperfect. Most of your publications also say that one component is missing in this. So is there any value in really emulating those models, or should we just leapfrog and make a better ML model, which is also quicker?
Yeah, so that's a good point. But every model is going to be imperfect. It's inevitable. Every ML model will be imperfect too. And so we can leapfrog those, but the danger in doing so is that they contain a lot of known biology and physics, right? And so finding ways to retain that information while switching out the components that represent large uncertainties or that need to be more closely informed by observational data would be a good approach. Now, you could also leapfrog, and I think that's kind of what the Klima project that Tapio Schneider is leading is seeking to do, really kind of starting from scratch. But they also are using a lot of the model components from existing models. So I think, ideally, because there is diversity in our understanding, in how our understanding is represented, but my dream would be to have this modularization where you can have machine learning representing various different components, switch them in and out, and ultimately create a meta model that encapsulates everything that's represented in all of the models. I'm not sure what that architecture would look like. It's not been done. I'm excited for the new machine learning approaches that are coming online. We were in my field, we're not trained. Nobody is really trained as a machine learning. We're an expert. We're not on the frontier of the techniques being used. We're using whatever there's a package for, basically. So as new approaches come online, as many of you are probably working with and developing, I think those will be immensely powerful for moving the field forward.
Can I jump in here a little bit too? Just because this touches on something, a comment I almost made when Patrick was talking about this fake tree data they had generated, and how well it worked. I think I have seen on several projects I've worked on where you can actually improve upon the target data with an ML model. And I know that sounds crazy, but the standard example I give when I describe this to people is, imagine you have a data set that labels cats and dogs and 10% of them are wrong, right? Your target data is just wrong. Well, your model will probably look at a dog and say, well, I think it's a 90% chance it's a dog and a 10% chance it's a cat, so I'm going to call it a dog. So even if the target data set has labeled it a cat, your model is going to label it a dog. You can actually see improvements through the model. And I don't know exactly how the project was done with the target, with the fake tree data that Patrick was talking about but there's a few scenarios in which you could imagine doing this and improving upon the data on purpose rather than just some accidental random cat and dog thing. And one is probably, like most of us know well about the power of using pre-trained networks. And then you can just have a little bit of data and get much better results out of that, and you don't have to have that much data to train it. So you could imagine in this tree, not tree scenario, you pre-train the network on 100% fake generated data, and then you fine tune it on real live data. Or you could imagine a simultaneous effect, which I actually think would probably work better, whereas you actually train with fake and real data simultaneously, but you weight the real data much more. So your loss function says, hey, I know this is real and you got it wrong, so I'm really I'm gonna punish you for that. Now, that said, moving over to the much more complex case that Trevor's been talking about with these emulators, you could do the same thing here. You could either train a model train one of these neural networks to emulate the data, freeze all except the last few layers, and then go and collect ground truth reference data and start trying to improve upon that model. And so I think there's probably a really, again, I haven't worked on this, but there's probably a way to take these emulators and use them to generate models that are better than what the emulator does upon its own. And once you've done that, you can start doing the work Trevor was talking about. Pop off a couple of layers, look at which features are actually generating this, and start gaining insights about what the network's actually doing and why, like what features are important. So I think there's probably a lot that can be done before they start over from scratch.
Thanks, Brookie. Yeah, the generation of the data was pretty simple. So we adopted the third approach you said. I'm not 100% sure if Isaac was weighting the photos from his front yard more than the generated photos. I kind of hope so. But basically, it was very simple-minded. I mean, we basically Isaac downloaded a bunch of random backgrounds from the internet and randomly plastered trees on them. And something as simple-minded as that, and thereby generated, 10,000 odd images that fed the neural net and basically bootstrapped it. And so it wasn't perfect. And we're still in the process of augmenting that with local data to make it more accurate, but it worked surprisingly well just to get started, and was very, very cheap, as opposed to sending someone down to Panama to take a bunch of photos. So that's great. And there's been a lot of work out there in terms of requirements, sort of automatic feature generation and so on, to augment the training of neural nets. So that's another area that I think is going to evolve pretty rapidly in the coming years. Any other questions? Okay. We have a question coming from Yan Cheng.
Yep. Thanks. Thanks for the interesting discussion and talks. My name is Yan, and I'm now a PhD student at the University of Copenhagen. I'm actually belongs to the research group where we have a large project. It's actually counting the tree outside of forest. The project is led by Martin. I don't know if you ever heard him, but my PhD project is actually focusing on studying the trajectories and mechanisms of drought-induced vegetation die-offs using high-resolution imagery PlanScope, and hopefully I will be integrating deep learning in my research as well, because it's kind of the hot topic here. My question is actually a couple of days ago we had a discussion with some of the postdocs from the computer science department, and actually they are kind of helping us to develop deep learning frameworks. And the discussion was actually they are more into using very raw data sets like the 3 bands RGB and near infrared bands, instead of adding other vegetation indices for tree mapping or other vegetation related detection using deep learning. So from my perspective as a person with remote sensing background without any deep knowledge in deep learning or computer science, my instinct idea is why not adding NDVI, EVI, those vegetation indices? Because basically what we used to do is to use those vegetation indices to monitor what is happening on the ground, plants on the ground. But the computer science postdocs, they were just saying those won't really adding much information, because the neural network itself will learn from the raw bands and come up with different sorts of new features based on those raw bands. So my question is, I would really like to know, how do you think of this Yeah.
Can I take that one? Because I love this question.
Sure, I love it too.
Okay, Trevor, you go first.
I'll be very brief anyway. Just saying this is a great example of the inherent difficulty between domain focused scientists communicating with like machine learning or data science experts. We encounter this all the time. But in this situation, I would say they're quite right. It's exactly what we do here. We use the raw bands as the predictors in the machine learning framework, and find that using things such as NDVI or EVI, for those of you who are not familiar with these acronyms, they're indices that are based on the raw bands. That it does not add any additional information. Actually, the predictive power is much better just using the raw information. Machine learning can detect information that we didn't know was there. So we've a history of constructing simplifications of the information available to us that we can digest and use and apply, such as these indices like NDVI. But machine learning knows how to map the raw information directly to the predictors. Sometimes it can help if there's a physical reason for something like NDVI, other than it just being a proxy of something, right? But in this case, it does seem to be better to use raw information than some empirical abstraction of it.
Yeah.
Thanks, Brookie. Over to you.
Well, I'm glad you went first, actually, because I've had different experiences. So first off, on a kind of more general level, I think this kind of represents a problem with a lot of the approaches, is that you have teams who are very smart and very good at computer vision saying, oh, I can go do remote sensing. And they just go take whatever model and do it. And then I think they a lot of times miss out on things. I think that creating collaborations where you have people who you either have both skill sets, or there are groups where the remote sensing background people are influencing the modeling just as much as the people building the architecture, where there's a lot of give and take there, can really improve on the understanding of what's done and the output of the product. But for this specific case, I would say training a model which is just a bunch of indices versus training a model which is just the raw bands, you're probably always going to do better with the raw bands. That said, I almost always will train my models with various bands added or not. And I have found usually I do see improvement. I mean, it's not it's not huge, but I usually, by throwing some, so thinking about this urban land use work, I included both NDVI and the built up index. And by doing that, I was improving my scores by, 1% or 2%. So it wasn't a game changer, but it is an improvement. And it probably depends on what you're trying to predict. For trees outside of forests, I do think you're going to see an improvement by including NDVI. We know that's going to have a strong signal. And yes, in principle, your model, if you train it long enough, should figure out this on its own. But as long as you're not taking information away, like saying, well, because I'm including NDVI, I'm not going to include my red band. I think you're going to get improved scores. Now, that said, one of the reasons your computer science group might be saying, let's forget about this, is because they want to work with 3 bands or something, because they're working with pre-trained imagery and all that's optical imagery. I do think there are smarter ways, because it's not just the spectral indices, but if you're working with, say, Sentinel data and or just whatever satellite imagery you're using, and you start going to like the full multispectral data, I think there is a lot to be learned from the inclusion of those other bands. And if you have a small amount of data and you're wanting to use a pre-trained network, there might be other solutions, like creating a multi-headed model, which is like RGB, a few band indices, a few of the higher index things, and then they get those architectures get trained and then combined at some layer and then output. So I do think there are probably interesting ways to use pre-trained networks and still get beyond just 3 bands.
So just a quick story from the research community. As I mentioned before, we were using computer vision techniques. We have this wonderful computational neuroscientist who's been building these neural models for detecting, essentially predicting the location of beaver dams. And the model actually, despite a lot of work on her end as far as tweaking the architecture, wasn't performing very well. And then Amgad, who unfortunately left, like I think he was here before, but he left, too bad. Amgad sort of sourced some more data that included a near infrared band, as well as a couple more locations. And all of a sudden the model really started performing super well. And this is probably a near best case scenario where the extra band, the near infrared band, turned out to be really much better at detecting water sources than just the visual bands. But it went from being a sort of a pretty crappily performing model to a shockingly good model, where it was actually surprising us how amazingly well performed. And she did do some other optimizations, but I think the consensus, certainly from her, was that it was largely because of the extra band that the model improves so much. And so just an example of just how much just including additional types of remote sensing data can really help.
Thanks. So quickly what Brookie said about the importance of working with actual scientists, for data scientists and domain scientists together to identify. For example, in that case, they domain scientists might have said, well, you should definitely use this band because obviously beaver dams reflect a lot in this band, and something that you mightn't have thought of immediately, but is something more obvious to somebody working in the domain, can really help speed the process and also avoid creating products that are based on correlations that are not causative too.
I see. I actually have a following question. So let's say I'm now working with the planiscope imagery. I'm using time series, and I tend to find for some locations there will be like a systematic georeference arrows. So if we found like systematic arrows in the imagery, in the raw products, can we also expect deep learning to learn it itself? Like there's a systematic arrow, and the deep learning can learn and then fix these arrows itself. Can we expect that and then discuss some of the pre-processing step as well? That's my I was trying to thinking out loud.
Yeah, I think definitely you can. We have similar issues with camera data, for example, where you have cameras mounted on towers that are continuously taking photos of the field of view. And you have view shifts where a bird lands on the camera and the camera moves slightly. And detecting those is definitely a machine learning amendable problem. It is a little tricky to correct, but definitely possible.
So you mean at some point we can discard those data pre-processing for fixing the systematic errors? Instead, we let the deep learning model to learn itself, or?
That depends on your architecture. I think you'd need to tell the machine learning that it needs to know that this is an expectation. Okay. Perhaps.
I see. Thanks.
Yeah, I would say you need to be really careful that it is systematic, right? Like if you find so you're working with the planet data, they've got this, a bunch of satellites. If half of them are shifted a pixel to the left and the other half are shifted a pixel to the right, it's actually going to blur. And if 100% of them are shifted the exact same way, the output of your model should just shift the prediction the exact same way. So it should just auto be, or in the exact opposite way. So it should just be corrected. But if there's variation in it, you're going to end up with blurriness in your data. So just be really clear that it is systematic. And it might be something that it's better to go ahead and do the pre-processing unless the pre-processing is difficult or time consuming, to a degree that it's, I don't know. I just think it's more transparent.
I see. Thanks.
Okay.
Yeah.
Looks like we have a couple of minutes left. Bishal, if you can ask your question quickly, we might be able to get through it. Otherwise, come to the community and ask it there.
So my question is to you actually. Like I just looked into into the website of Earthshot. Like, is there any way we can be involved? Like, even though like I'm planning to do my graduate degree in something else, like, is there any way we can be involved for a long time with your organization?
Yeah, for sure. So I dropped an invite link to the research community, where it's a citizen science ecological research community where we have people who are mostly not ecological researchers performing various forms of investigation and data science and so on and so forth to advance the cause. And we do have people who are professionals and who are ecologists in the group as well. So come on in and check it out. And with that, I will thank Trevor and Brookie for a really amazing and fun hour and a half. And yeah, thank you so much for coming today. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks, Patrick, for organizing.
Thank you.
Great discussion. And thank you all for coming. Thanks, Brookie. It was great to meet you. Meet you.
Yeah. All of what Trevor just said, yeah, this has been really enjoyable. So thank you, Earthshot. Thank you, Trevor. Thanks everyone for attending.
Awesome.
Cheers.
Bye everyone. See you in the community.
Cheers.